Tom Hanks worked at Langston Industries, one of the largest and most prestigious companies in the city. For over 10 years, he had walked the polished hallways, mopped the floors, emptied the trash, and cleaned the windows. Yet most people barely noticed him. To them, he was invisible, a quiet presence who moved around quietly, always in the background. They called him just the janitor, and many treated him as if he didn't exist. But Tom wasn't just any janitor. He was intelligent, observant, and incredibly patient. Over the years, he had learned to read people, to notice the smallest details, and to remember conversations that others forgot within minutes. He understood patterns, how people acted when they were nervous, when they were lying, or when they were planning something secret. He had watched employees argue quietly behind closed doors, seen executives sneak into offices late at night, and overheard conversations that seemed innocent but carried hidden meanings. On most days, Tom went about his duties quietly.
He cleaned offices, polished floors, refilled coffee machines, and tidied the break rooms.
He never complained, never asked for attention, and never acted superior. People assumed he had nothing important to offer, that he was only capable of simple tasks. But deep inside, Tom was building a mental map of the company, memorizing not just the layout but the people, their habits, their secrets, and their weaknesses. One Monday morning, the office buzzed with unusual energy. Employees whispered in corners, their eyes wide with worry. Tom, pushing a mop along the hallway, noticed that even the usual chatter seemed tense. He paused near the receptionist desk to refill the hand sanitizer, and overheard two assistants talking in hushed tones. "Did you hear? The CEO, George Clooney, might be in trouble," one said, her voice trembling slightly. "Trouble? What do you mean?" the other whispered. "I don't know all the details, but there's something about missing funds and legal issues. They're saying it could become a big trial." Tom froze for a moment. George Clooney was not just a CEO to him. He was a man of integrity, someone who had always worked hard, been fair, and respected everyone in the office. Tom had seen how George treated employees with kindness, how he encouraged teamwork, and how he cared about the people who worked under him. The thought that George could be falsely accused angered him, though he didn't show it. He continued his work, quietly moving through the hallways, but his mind was racing. He knew the company had enemies, people who might benefit from George's downfall. He had observed patterns before, small inconsistencies in reports, secretive behavior by certain executives, but he had never thought it would escalate to something so serious. Later that day, Tom entered the CEO's office to clean. George was sitting at his desk reviewing papers, looking tense but composed. Tom carefully dusted the shelves and polished the desk, all while observing George. "Everything okay, Tom?" George asked without looking up. "Yes, sir," Tom replied, keeping his voice calm. "Everything is clean." George smiled faintly but didn't speak further. Tom noticed the dark circles under George's eyes, the tightness in his shoulders, and the slight trembling in his hands. He could tell that George was under immense pressure. After finishing his work, Tom stepped out of the office and walked down the corridor. He noticed other employees whispering and glancing around nervously. He realized that the tension was spreading like wildfire. People who had never cared about anyone else's problems were suddenly afraid, unsure of who to trust. Tom knew he couldn't ignore this situation. Even though he was just the janitor, he had knowledge that no one else had. Over the years, he had observed the company closely, memorized details, and paid attention to things that others thought were unimportant. He had seen inconsistencies in financial records, heard conversations about secret meetings, and noticed how certain employees acted strangely when they thought no one was watching. He realized that if anyone could help George, it might be him. That evening, after the office had emptied, Tom stayed behind. He walked quietly through the dimly lit hallways, stopping at the offices of certain managers. He didn't touch anything or move papers, but he listened. He remembered every word, every tone, every hesitation. He began to piece together a mental picture of what might have happened. Over the next few days, the office atmosphere grew heavier. The trial was approaching and everyone was on edge. Employees whispered behind closed doors, rumors spread like wildfire, and people avoided eye contact with each other. Tom continued his work, moving silently through the corridors, unnoticed by most but aware of everything. One afternoon, while cleaning near the accounting department, he overheard a conversation that made his heart race. Two senior managers were talking in hushed tones, unaware that Tom was nearby. "If we can frame George properly, no one will suspect us," one manager said. "The board will have no choice but to remove him, and then we take over." Tom felt a surge of anger but kept his voice calm. He continued cleaning, pretending to focus on his work while storing every detail in his mind. He knew George was innocent, and now he had proof that someone inside the company was plotting against him. The more he listened, the more details he gathered. He learned about secret transfers, hidden documents, and carefully planned manipulations. He realized that the conspiracy was bigger than he had thought, involving multiple people who had planned everything meticulously. Despite the danger, Tom knew he had to act. He couldn't let George be falsely accused, but he also knew he had to be careful. He couldn't reveal himself too soon, or he might become a target. He needed a plan, one that would allow him to expose the truth without putting himself at unnecessary risk. Tom spent his nights at home going over the details in his mind. He created mental maps of the office, noting where people worked, when they moved around, and who had access to sensitive information. He remembered every conversation, every unusual action, every small clue that might seem insignificant to others but could be crucial in revealing the truth. He also reflected on his own life. For years, he had been invisible to the world, seen as just the janitor. People overlooked him, underestimated him, and dismissed his intelligence. But now, for the first time, he realized that being overlooked could be an advantage. People would never suspect him. No one would watch him closely. He could gather evidence quietly, unnoticed, while others focused on more obvious suspects. Tom felt a sense of purpose he hadn't felt before. His work, his patience, and his observation skills were finally going to matter. He was no longer just a janitor cleaning floors. He was someone who could make a real difference, someone who could protect an innocent man and expose the truth. The next morning, he arrived at the office early. The corridors were quiet, and the first rays of sunlight reflected off the polished floors. He moved silently, checking offices, observing employees, and noting unusual behavior. He even smiled quietly to himself, knowing that the world would soon see that just the janitor could be much more than they imagined. When George arrived, tired and anxious, Tom greeted him politely, keeping his thoughts hidden. George, unaware of Tom's plans, continued his work, preparing for the trial that could change everything. Tom watched silently, feeling a mixture of determination and concern. He knew the coming days would be challenging, but he was ready. He would prove that courage, intelligence, and careful observation could come from the most unexpected places. By the end of the week, Tom had gathered enough information to begin forming a plan. He knew the trial would be intense, the opposition clever and deceitful, but he also knew that the truth was on their side. He would have to act carefully, step by step, and at the right moment. As he finished cleaning the CEO's office one evening, he paused and looked out the window at the city skyline. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the buildings. Tom felt a quiet confidence rising within him. For years he had been invisible, but now he was ready to step into the light, to do what he had always been capable of, and to protect someone who deserved justice. He whispered to himself softly, almost like a promise, "I may be just the janitor, but I will not let the truth be hidden. Not now. Not ever." The days following Tom Hanks' discovery of the senior manager's plot were tense. The entire office seemed to have transformed. Where there was once laughter and casual conversations, now there were whispered voices, sidelong glances, and nervous footsteps. Employees tiptoed through hallways as if afraid of being overheard, and the sense of unease was palpable. Tom moved through the office with his usual quiet diligence, but now he carried a heavy weight on his shoulders. The truth he had discovered, that George Clooney, the CEO he respected, was being framed, needed to be revealed, but carefully. He knew rushing or making a single wrong move could ruin everything. The conspirators were clever, and if they sensed he knew, he could become a target himself. On Monday morning, Tom started his day earlier than usual. The sun had barely risen when he walked into the building. He pushed his cleaning cart down the hallway, sweeping and mopping, but every step was deliberate, every glance purposeful. He observed the employees as they began trickling into the office. There was tension in their movements, a nervous energy that Tom had never seen in his 10 years there. He passed by the accounting department and noticed a young assistant named Emma Stone huddled over her computer. She seemed unusually anxious, glancing behind her repeatedly. Tom paused near the doorway, pretending to adjust a trash can, and listened carefully. "I don't like this," Emma whispered to a colleague. "It doesn't feel right. How could George do something like this?" Her colleague shrugged but looked uneasy. "I don't know. I just do what I'm told. But people are talking. I heard someone say he's being accused of embezzlement." Tom's jaw tightened slightly. He knew George was innocent, and the thought of these rumors spreading through the company made him even more determined. He continued cleaning, making mental notes of who was saying what and how people reacted. Every small detail could be important later. Later that afternoon, while polishing the conference room table, Tom overheard two senior managers talking quietly but intensely. "We have to make sure the evidence is ready before the trial starts," one said. "If George suspects anything, he could ruin everything." The other manager nodded. "I've already adjusted the financial records and the board is convinced. George doesn't even know how carefully we planned this. By the time the trial begins, it will be too late for him." Tom's heart raced, but he kept his calm. He finished polishing the table, then walked quietly out of the room, storing every word in his memory. He now had proof, mental proof at least, that the accusation against George was manufactured. It wasn't just rumors anymore. There was a plan, carefully executed by the conspirators, designed to destroy the CEO. That evening, after most employees had left, Tom stayed behind to review what he had learned. He wandered through the hallways slowly, stopping outside offices, recalling conversations and piecing together the puzzle. He realized that if he wanted to help George, he had to act strategically. He couldn't simply reveal everything at once. He had to gather undeniable evidence, document patterns, and find witnesses who could corroborate his observations. The next day, Tom noticed something unusual near the IT department. A man he had never seen before was moving quickly through the hallways, carrying a stack of folders and glancing over his shoulder nervously. Tom pretended to mop the floor nearby but kept an eye on the stranger. The man entered the finance manager's office, and Tom could hear bits of the conversation. Words like fake reports, manipulate records, and cover everything drifted through the partially open door. Tom's eyes widened. This was exactly what he had suspected. The plot was bigger than he thought. Multiple people were involved, and they were actively tampering with evidence to make George look guilty. Over the next few days, Tom continued to observe, taking careful notes in his mind. He memorized the locations of sensitive files, the times when certain employees were in their offices, and even subtle habits, like how a particular manager always left a drawer unlocked or how a colleague always took long breaks when the documents were vulnerable. Despite the tension, Tom kept his usual calm and polite demeanor. To most people, he was still just the janitor. No one suspected that he was quietly gathering intelligence that could save the CEO. The irony was not lost on him. He had been invisible for years. Yet now his observations might be the key to justice. One afternoon, as he was cleaning near George's office, the CEO stepped out to grab a cup of coffee. He looked exhausted, his suit slightly rumpled and his face lined with worry. Tom offered a polite nod. "Morning, Tom," George said, managing a faint smile. "Everything okay?" "Yes, sir," Tom replied. "All clean and ready for the day." George glanced around, noticing the polished floors and neatly arranged papers. "I appreciate it. You always make this office feel professional." Tom nodded quietly but didn't say more. He respected George too much to discuss the danger out loud in the office. Yet, in his mind, he was already planning the steps needed to protect him. By midweek, Tom had noticed inconsistencies in the financial reports that no one else seemed to see. Transactions had been altered, records duplicated, and some documents had small but crucial changes. These weren't mistakes, they were deliberate manipulations designed to frame George. He made mental notes of every discrepancy, every altered number, every suspicious document. Late one evening, after everyone had left, Tom stayed behind to go over the patterns he had observed. He walked slowly through the empty hallways, thinking aloud to himself. "They think I'm invisible," he whispered softly. "They think I can't see what they're doing. But I notice everything. I always notice." His thoughts were interrupted by a faint sound from the finance department. He peeked through the doorway and saw the same two senior managers from before, still discussing plans in whispers. One of them was holding a folder with documents Tom had memorized earlier. He noticed the way they were handling the papers, carefully avoiding leaving fingerprints or evidence. Tom took a deep breath and made a decision. It wasn't enough to just observe. He had to act, but he also had to be careful. He couldn't risk being caught snooping or making mistakes that could endanger George further. He needed a plan that was smart, quiet, and foolproof. Over the next 2 days, Tom carefully tracked every movement of the conspirators. He observed the way they accessed files, the times they were alone in offices, and the subtle interactions that indicated secret coordination. He even noticed small habits like how one manager always wore a blue tie when handling certain documents, or how another always hummed a tune when nervous. These small details, which others ignored, were important. They painted a clear picture of guilt and intent. Meanwhile, the office environment became more tense. Employees were whispering about the trial, sharing rumors and worrying about the future. Tom moved through the hallways quietly, offering polite nods and greetings while secretly documenting every detail in his mind. He realized that he had more information than anyone else in the building, perhaps more than the lawyers themselves. On Friday afternoon, Tom passed by George's office and noticed him speaking quietly on the phone. He couldn't hear the conversation, but he could see the stress on George's face, the tight grip on the phone, and the faint shake in his hands. Tom felt a surge of determination. He knew that George was under immense pressure, and that if the truth didn't come out, the CEO's reputation and career could be destroyed. That evening, Tom stayed late again, preparing for what he knew was coming, the trial. He mapped out in his mind every piece of information he had gathered, every pattern, every inconsistency. He imagined how he could present it when the time came, how he could subtly guide the defense team without revealing himself too soon. He realized that his years of being unnoticed, of being just the janitor, had given him a unique advantage. He could observe freely, gather evidence without suspicion, and act when the moment was right. As the office grew silent, Tom sat on a bench in the empty hallway, thinking about the days ahead. He remembered his life before joining Langston Industries, modest, quiet, often overlooked. But he also remembered every lesson he had learned: patience, observation, careful listening, and the ability to act without being noticed. These skills, which others had dismissed as trivial, were now his greatest strengths. He whispered to himself, almost like a promise, "They won't see me coming. I'll protect George. I'll show them that the truth matters more than appearances. I may be invisible to them, but I'm ready to make a difference." With that, he stood up, pushed his cart down the hall one last time, and returned home, knowing that the coming days would test him in ways he had never imagined. But he was ready. He had a plan, knowledge, and determination. He would no longer be invisible. He would act when the time was right, and he would ensure that justice was served. The morning of the trial arrived with an unusual chill in the air. The city streets were busy with commuters, but inside the Langston Industries building and beyond, a storm of tension had been building for days. George Clooney, the respected CEO, had been summoned to court to defend himself against accusations that could destroy his career, reputation, and the company he had built from the ground up. Tom Hanks, the janitor who had quietly observed everything for years, felt a mixture of anxiety and determination. He had never been inside a courtroom before, not as a participant and certainly not as someone who would play a pivotal role. Yet he knew that what he had discovered about the conspiracy against George could turn the case around. But timing and careful planning were crucial. Revealing his knowledge too early could jeopardize everything. As the trial began, the courtroom was filled with people, journalists, board members, lawyers, and curious onlookers. Cameras flashed as George Clooney entered, calm and composed despite the weight of the accusations. He greeted his lawyers with a quiet nod and took his seat at the defense table. Tom, disguised in his janitorial uniform, quietly followed in the gallery. People glanced at him briefly but paid no real attention. To them, he was just the janitor, invisible and irrelevant. The prosecutor opened the case with a confident, almost theatrical presentation. He laid out the accusations against George: missing funds, manipulated financial documents, and unethical decisions that had allegedly caused the company significant losses. The evidence appeared convincing at first glance, and some members of the jury murmured among themselves. Tom listened carefully, his eyes scanning the courtroom. He noticed discrepancies immediately. The documents presented as evidence didn't match his mental notes from the office. Certain transactions were listed incorrectly, and some financial reports were missing the subtle irregularities he had memorized. He also observed the behavior of the conspirators, some of whom were in the audience watching George nervously. Their expressions betrayed both guilt and worry, though most tried to maintain a composed exterior. As the first witnesses were called, Tom realized how precarious George's situation was. Employees who had been coerced or manipulated were giving testimony that seemed convincing, but was based on false information. One by one, the witnesses described situations that painted George as negligent or dishonest. The defense lawyers struggled to respond, trying to counter the narrative without concrete evidence of their own. During a short recess, Tom quietly approached one of George's junior lawyers, Michael Douglas. "I know something that could help," he said, his voice calm but urgent. Michael looked at him skeptically, clearly surprised to hear anything from the janitor. "You? The janitor?" Michael asked, his eyebrows raised. "Yes," Tom replied. "I've been observing everything in the office for years. I know the patterns, the documents, and the people involved. I can provide evidence that shows George is innocent. But you have to trust me and listen carefully." Michael hesitated but saw the determination in Tom's eyes. Finally, he nodded. "All right, I'll listen. But we need proof, and it must be presented carefully." Tom spent the next few hours recounting everything he had memorized: the altered documents, the secret meetings, and the subtle behaviors of the conspirators. He even described the times when files had been moved, the unusual access to restricted areas, and the way certain employees had coordinated to make George look guilty. Michael took detailed notes, realizing that the janitor's observations could indeed change the course of the trial. When the trial resumed, Tom found a seat in the gallery, keeping a close eye on the proceedings. Each witness, each piece of evidence, each statement was examined in the light of the knowledge he had gathered. He began to notice small gaps and inconsistencies in the prosecution's case, things that no one else seemed to recognize. During a critical moment, a document was presented as evidence against George. The prosecutor claimed it showed a transfer of funds that could only have been authorized by the CEO. Tom's heart raced as he recognized the document from his observations. "That's fake," he whispered under his breath. "I've seen the real records, and this isn't accurate." Michael Douglas noticed Tom's reaction and subtly signaled for a break. Behind closed doors, Tom explained in detail what he had seen. He described the differences between the real documents and the forged ones, pointing out specific details like dates, signatures, and subtle marks that proved the manipulation. Michael's eyes widened. This was exactly what the defense needed to challenge the credibility of the evidence. Back in the courtroom, the defense began to introduce their counterpoints, carefully using the observations Tom had provided. They highlighted inconsistencies in the financial records, questioned the reliability of certain witnesses, and subtly pointed out that some employees had been pressured to provide false testimony. The prosecutor tried to dismiss these points, but the jury began to notice the gaps in the accusations. Throughout the day, Tom remained alert, watching everything closely. He noticed the nervous gestures of the conspirators, their subtle glances, and the way they avoided eye contact when certain facts were mentioned. He also observed George's calm demeanor, the quiet confidence that came from knowing he was innocent and had support, even if invisible. In the afternoon session, a key witness was called, a junior accountant who had been pressured to falsify reports. Under the guidance of the defense and with Tom's subtle prompting, the witness began to speak more openly. She described the irregularities she had noticed, the instructions she had received, and the unusual behaviors of the senior managers. Her testimony started to unravel the prosecution's carefully constructed narrative. Tom felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. Every observation, every piece of information he had collected was beginning to make a difference. The trial was no longer one-sided. George's innocence, carefully documented and supported by Tom's insights, was starting to shine through the cracks in the prosecution's case. By the end of the day, the mood in the courtroom had shifted. The prosecution was still confident, but the jury and observers had begun to see that the situation was more complicated than they had initially thought. The evidence against George was no longer airtight, and the possibility that he had been framed was becoming increasingly plausible. As the courtroom emptied for the night, Tom stayed behind, quietly reflecting on the day's events. He knew the trial was far from over. The prosecutors would regroup, bring in more witnesses, and attempt to strengthen their case. But he also knew that George now had a chance to prove his innocence and to expose the true culprits. Tom walked through the empty hallways of the courthouse, thinking about the next steps. He realized that timing would be critical. He couldn't reveal all he knew at once. He had to provide information strategically at the right moment to maximize its impact. He also needed to ensure that he remained unnoticed until the precise moment when his observations would carry the greatest weight. He thought about George, sitting in the courtroom hours earlier, calm yet tense, and felt a surge of determination. He had seen the CEO's integrity firsthand, and he knew that the man did not deserve this ordeal. Tom whispered to himself, "I will help him. I will make sure the truth comes out no matter what it takes." The night grew late, and Tom finally left the courthouse, blending into the quiet streets. The city lights reflected off the wet pavement, casting long shadows. He felt a mix of exhaustion and anticipation. The trial was just beginning, and the real battle for justice was yet to come. Over the next few days, Tom continued his careful observations. He tracked the behavior of the conspirators, noticed small discrepancies in testimonies, and refined his mental record of the evidence. Every subtle detail, the way someone hesitated before answering a question, the slight alteration of a signature, the nervous tapping of a foot, was carefully noted. He also observed George during brief breaks in the trial. Despite the stress, the CEO remained composed, showing respect to everyone in the courtroom and maintaining a quiet dignity that inspired others. Tom admired him more than ever. He realized that courage wasn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it was quiet, steady, and unwavering in the face of adversity. One afternoon, after a particularly intense session, Tom approached Michael Douglas again. "I've identified several patterns," he said quietly. "If we present them correctly, it will show that the evidence against George is manipulated. We can turn the case around." Michael nodded, impressed by the janitor's insight. "You've really paid attention," he said. "I never imagined someone could notice all of this. But this could be the key." Tom smiled faintly. "I've been watching for years. People think I don't see anything, but I see everything." By the end of the week, the trial had shifted. The defense, armed with Tom's observations and subtle guidance, had begun to challenge the prosecution's narrative effectively. The jury was no longer convinced of George's guilt. Small cracks in the case had grown into visible fissures, and the possibility that he had been framed was becoming increasingly likely. As Tom left the courthouse that evening, he felt a quiet satisfaction. The trial was far from over, but George now had a fighting chance. The janitor, who had been invisible for years, was finally making his presence felt, not through loud declarations or dramatic actions, but through careful observation, patience, and unwavering dedication to the truth. Tom whispered to himself as he walked through the empty streets. "They called me just the janitor, but they will see that even the quietest person can make a difference. The truth will come out. I will make sure of it." The courtroom was tense as the fourth day of the trial began. George Clooney sat quietly at the defense table, his hands folded neatly, his eyes scanning the room. The prosecution continued presenting witnesses, each one carefully chosen to make George appear negligent and dishonest. Every piece of evidence seemed designed to push him closer to a verdict of guilt. Meanwhile, Tom Hanks, the janitor, moved quietly along the corridors outside the courtroom. To anyone glancing at him, he was simply a worker cleaning floors, adjusting chairs, or wiping windows. No one suspected that he carried within him a mental archive of critical observations that could decide the fate of the CEO. Tom had spent the previous night reviewing every detail he had collected over the past weeks. He had memorized documents, noted the behaviors of suspicious managers, and mentally mapped patterns in the office's operations. For the first time, he felt a sense of purpose beyond his daily routine. He was no longer invisible. He was prepared to act, but he needed the perfect moment. As the trial began that morning, the defense team faced a challenge. One of the witnesses, a senior accountant, testified that certain transactions appeared to be approved by George. The prosecutor highlighted these documents with confidence, believing they were irrefutable evidence of wrongdoing. George's lawyer, Michael Douglas, looked at the files but struggled to find a concrete counterargument. Tom observed from the gallery, noticing subtle details the lawyers had overlooked. The dates on the documents were inconsistent, the signatures slightly different from George's usual style, and some entries had markings that indicated manipulation by someone else. Tom knew that if presented correctly, this information could completely undermine the prosecution's case. During a recess, Tom approached Michael cautiously. "I can help," he whispered. "I've memorized the patterns of these documents and can explain exactly how they were altered. I can show that George didn't authorize any of this." Michael hesitated, unsure how to react. "You? How? What do you mean?" Tom smiled faintly. "I've been watching The Office for years. I know who accesses the documents, how they alter them, and even the exact ways they manipulate the records. I can explain it to the court step by step. But we must be careful, it has to come out at the right moment." Michael finally nodded. "All right, let's do it. But we need a plan. You'll testify, and we'll prepare the evidence carefully. Timing is everything." Tom spent the next hour with Michael, quietly reviewing his observations. He explained in detail how certain managers had altered documents, the patterns of manipulation, and the specific instances where evidence had been fabricated to implicate George. Michael took meticulous notes, realizing that the janitor's insights were far more precise than anything the defense team could have prepared on their own. When the trial resumed, Tom felt a surge of determination. He knew that stepping into the courtroom would change everything. He wasn't just a janitor anymore. He was a witness to the truth, and he had the power to expose the conspiracy. The defense called Tom to testify. The courtroom murmured in surprise. "The janitor?" whispered one of the spectators. Even George looked momentarily astonished, but Tom remained calm, his expression steady, his voice clear. "I've been observing the company for many years," Tom began. "I noticed patterns in documents, meetings, and employee behavior. I believe some evidence presented against Mr. Clooney has been manipulated by certain employees." The prosecutor scoffed. "A janitor? You expect the court to believe a janitor has any knowledge of financial documents?" Tom remained unshaken. "I may be a janitor, but I've observed the company closely. I've memorized details that others overlooked. I can explain exactly how some documents were altered and who was responsible." The judge allowed Tom to proceed. Slowly, methodically, he outlined the discrepancies in the documents, describing dates, signatures, and the small alterations that indicated manipulation. He explained the behavior of employees who had coordinated to create false evidence, and he highlighted the patterns that no casual observer would notice. As Tom spoke, the courtroom shifted. The jury leaned forward, listening intently. The defense lawyers nodded, taking careful notes. Even the prosecution looked surprised. The precision and clarity of Tom's testimony challenged their entire case. One by one, Tom described how the suspicious managers had accessed records, moved files, and fabricated transactions. He explained that the documents presented as evidence were inconsistent with the company's normal operations, and that George had no involvement in any of the alterations. The tension in the courtroom grew. The conspirators sitting in the audience exchanged worried glances. Their carefully constructed plot was beginning to unravel, exposed by someone they had dismissed as invisible. Michael Douglas seized the opportunity to reinforce Tom's testimony. He presented authentic documents alongside the altered ones, highlighting the differences that Tom had meticulously described. Charts, timelines, and patterns became clear, and the jury could now see the contrast between truth and manipulation. By the end of the day, the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted dramatically. The once confident prosecutors now looked uneasy. George's innocence was beginning to emerge through the clarity of Tom's observations and the careful presentation of evidence. The jury, previously leaning toward the prosecution, began to reconsider their assumptions. After the session, George approached Tom quietly. "I can't believe it," he said softly. "You've just changed everything. I never knew you knew so much." Tom shook his head. "I've always noticed, sir. I just never had the right moment to speak. Now was the time." George smiled faintly. "You've saved more than just me. You've saved the company's reputation. I owe you more than words can express." Tom returned to his duties, quietly polishing floors and arranging chairs. To most of the courtroom, he was still the janitor, but he knew differently. He had made a real impact. His careful observation, patience, and knowledge had turned the trial in George's favor. Over the next few days, Tom continued to provide guidance to the defense. He remained discreet, offering subtle suggestions about which witnesses to call, which evidence to emphasize, and how to challenge inconsistencies. Each move was calculated, precise, and effective. The prosecution, frustrated by the unexpected turn of events, tried to reinforce their case. They brought in new witnesses and attempted to clarify discrepancies, but Tom's insights had already weakened their foundation. Every strategy they employed was met with logical counterpoints, often guided by the quiet observations of the janitor they had overlooked. Throughout it all, Tom remained humble. He never sought recognition or praise. His goal was simple: to ensure the truth came out and that George Clooney, the man he respected deeply, was proven innocent. He had discovered the power of observation, and now he wielded it with quiet confidence. By the end of the week, the trial had shifted from a seemingly certain defeat for George to a fight where the outcome was uncertain. The jury had begun to see that evidence had been manipulated, that certain employees had conspired against the CEO, and that George himself had acted with integrity throughout. As the courtroom emptied for the evening, Tom walked through the hallways with a quiet sense of satisfaction. He knew the most critical moments of the trial were still ahead, but the foundation for justice had been laid. His years of unnoticed work of being just the janitor had now become the key to uncovering the truth. Alone in the empty courthouse, Tom paused and looked around. He thought about the irony of the situation. For years, people had dismissed him, underestimated him, and ignored him entirely. Now those same people were beginning to see that courage. Intelligence and impact were not limited to those with titles, suits, or influence. He whispered to himself, almost like a quiet vow. "They called me just the janitor. But the truth doesn't need a title. I will make sure it comes out no matter what." The city outside continued its usual pace, oblivious to the quiet revolution that had taken place within the courtroom. Tom walked home that night with a steady resolve. The trial was not over, but the tide had begun to turn, and when the moment came, he would be ready to ensure that justice prevailed, not through force or drama, but through careful observation, patience, and the quiet courage of someone the world had underestimated. The courtroom buzzed with tension as the fifth day of the trial began. Every seat was filled. Journalists, employees, board members, and curious onlookers had gathered to watch the proceedings. George Clooney sat quietly at the defense table, calm yet determined, while Tom Hanks, the janitor, quietly observed from the gallery. To the untrained eye, he was just doing his usual job, adjusting a chair or straightening the floor tiles. But every glance, every movement, every word spoken by witnesses and lawyers was meticulously noted in his mind. The prosecution appeared confident at first. They called another witness, a senior manager who had been involved in the manipulation of documents. The witness claimed that George had authorized all transactions and that the inconsistencies were simply clerical errors. The prosecution presented a series of carefully prepared spreadsheets, charts, and reports, hoping to strengthen their case. Tom watched carefully, analyzing every piece of evidence. His mind raced as he recalled the documents he had memorized in the office, dates that didn't match, signatures that were subtly different, patterns of access that proved the documents had been altered by someone else. He realized that the prosecution was relying on assumptions, not facts, and that the witness would crumble if the right questions were asked. During a short recess, Tom approached Michael Douglas, George's lawyer. "We need to focus on the patterns," he whispered. "The documents they're showing are altered. I can explain exactly how and why. If we present it clearly, the jury will see the manipulation." Michael nodded, impressed by Tom's precision. "You've given us the guidance we needed. Let's do it carefully. Timing is everything." When the trial resumed, Michael called Tom to the stand again. The courtroom grew silent. People murmured in surprise. Some whispered, "The janitor?" But Tom remained composed, his voice steady as he began to speak. I have observed the company for many years, Tom began. I have seen the way documents are handled, the way files are moved, and how some employees have altered records. I can show the court that certain documents presented as evidence against Mr. Clooney have been manipulated. The prosecutor tried to dismiss him. You're a janitor. How could you possibly know about these documents? Tom held his ground. I may be a janitor, but I have been present when these documents were accessed. I have memorized details that others have overlooked. I can explain how certain entries were changed and by whom. Slowly, Tom began to outline the inconsistencies. He explained how dates were altered to appear after George had supposedly approved transactions, how signatures were subtly different from George's authentic signature, and how some documents were moved between offices to create a false impression of wrongdoing. Every detail he described was precise and supported by his careful observations. Michael Douglas presented the authentic documents alongside the altered ones. He pointed out differences that only someone who had observed the office closely could identify. Marks on the paper, the way files were stacked, and patterns of access that clearly indicated manipulation by the conspirators. The jury listened intently, visibly intrigued by the evidence. As Tom continued, the courtroom atmosphere began to shift. The conspirators sitting quietly in the audience exchanged nervous glances. Their carefully constructed plan was beginning to unravel. For the first time, they realized that the person they had ignored, the janitor, was now their biggest threat. One by one, Tom described the actions of the employees who had orchestrated the scheme. He recalled secret meetings, altered schedules, and unusual behavior that indicated coordination. He explained how they had created false evidence, coerced witnesses, and attempted to frame George for actions he did not commit. The jury was captivated. They could see the logic in Tom's observations and the consistency in his testimony. Even some of the skeptical spectators leaned forward, clearly reconsidering their assumptions. George remained calm at the defense table, quietly absorbing the information, while a sense of hope began to replace his earlier anxiety. Michael Douglas asked Tom to illustrate the manipulations using a timeline he had prepared. Tom carefully laid out each step, showing how the conspirators had altered documents, moved files, and attempted to mislead both the company and the court. The jury could now see the deliberate actions taken to frame George, and the prosecution's confidence began to falter. During cross-examination, the lead prosecutor tried to undermine Tom's credibility. How could a janitor possibly know all this, he asked. You are making claims based on what you saw, but isn't it possible you are mistaken? Tom remained composed. I am not mistaken, he said firmly. I have observed these events firsthand over a period of years. I know the patterns, the behaviors, and the alterations. My observations are accurate, and I can provide evidence to support them. The prosecutor pressed further, trying to shake his confidence. But Tom's calm demeanor and precise knowledge made it clear that he was telling the truth. The jury began to see that George had indeed been framed, and that the manipulations were not clerical errors but deliberate attempts to damage him. Later in the afternoon, another witness was called, a junior accountant who had been coerced into assisting with the document alterations. Initially, she hesitated, clearly nervous, but when Tom subtly nodded from the gallery, she found the courage to speak openly. She described how she had been instructed to make changes, how certain managers had supervised her work, and how she had been told to make it appear as though George had authorized everything. Her testimony, combined with Tom's observations, created an unbreakable chain of evidence. The jury could see the pattern, understand the manipulation, and recognize that George had been an innocent target. The prosecution's case was rapidly losing credibility. By the end of the day, the courtroom had transformed. Where there had been confidence and certainty in George's guilt, there was now doubt, confusion, and a growing recognition that the CEO had been framed. The conspirators, once smug and self-assured, now sat in silence, their expressions betraying fear and frustration. After the session, George approached Tom quietly. I don't know how to thank you, he said softly. You've turned everything around. I never imagined someone I barely knew could make such a difference. Tom shook his head, smiling faintly. I'm not a hero, sir. I just noticed things no one else did. That's all. The truth needed someone to speak for it, and I was in the right place at the right time. George placed a hand on his shoulder. You've done more than that. You've saved me and you've saved this company. People will finally see you for who you are, not just the janitor." Tom returned to his duties quietly, polishing floors and tidying chairs. To the outside world, he remained invisible. But he knew that the course of the trial, and George's future, was now changing because of his careful observations and courage. Over the next few days, the trial continued, and the defense, guided by Tom's insights, systematically dismantled the prosecution's case. Witnesses began to reveal inconsistencies in their statements, documents were proven fraudulent, and the jury increasingly saw the manipulation that had taken place. Tom remained quietly present, providing subtle guidance and ensuring that every critical piece of information was introduced effectively. The conspirators grew desperate. They attempted to discredit Tom, to question his presence in the courtroom, and even suggested that his testimony was unreliable. But the evidence he provided, combined with corroborating witnesses and the clear timeline of manipulations, made their efforts futile. By the end of the week, it was clear that the tide had turned completely. George Clooney's innocence was evident, the conspiracy had been exposed, and the jury was beginning to see that the so-called just the janitor was in fact the most important witness in the entire trial. As the courtroom emptied, Tom walked through the halls quietly, reflecting on the day's events. He had always been invisible, unnoticed, and underestimated. Now his observations, patience, and careful planning had made him indispensable. He realized that courage and intelligence were not always about titles or positions. They were about being aware, persistent, and willing to act when it mattered most. He paused outside the courtroom, looking at George, who was speaking quietly with his lawyers. A sense of quiet satisfaction filled Tom's heart. The trial was far from over, but the foundation for justice had been firmly established. George's innocence had been revealed, and the conspirators were beginning to face the consequences of their actions. Alone in the empty courthouse, Tom whispered to himself, "They called me just the janitor, but even the quietest person can change everything. I've done my part and the truth will come out. The world will see that justice can be served when someone is willing to notice, to act, and to speak up." As he left the courthouse that evening, the city lights reflected off the wet streets, casting long shadows. Tom walked home with a steady resolve. He had turned the trial around, exposed the conspiracy, and begun to restore George's reputation. The climax was near, and he was ready to ensure that the final day of the trial would confirm the CEO's innocence once and for all. The morning of the final day of the trial arrived with a tense, almost electric atmosphere. The courtroom was packed. Journalists jostled to get the best view, and every seat was filled with spectators curious to see the outcome. George Clooney, calm yet clearly burdened by the weeks of tension, sat at the defense table. Beside him, Michael Douglas and the rest of the defense team quietly reviewed their notes. Tom Hanks, the janitor, quietly took his usual place in the gallery, his posture calm and unassuming. To the crowd, he was just the man who cleaned floors and polished chairs. No one suspected the immense role he had played in preparing George's defense, the subtle guidance he had given, and the detailed observations he had meticulously memorized over the past weeks. As the proceedings began, the judge called the courtroom to order. The day's agenda was clear: final witness testimonies, closing arguments, and jury deliberations. The prosecution seemed determined to present last-minute evidence, hoping to sway the jury before the truth fully emerged. The first witness called was a junior accountant who had been coerced into helping manipulate documents. Initially hesitant, she began recounting her experience, but with more confidence this time. She described in detail how certain senior managers had instructed her to alter financial records, create false reports, and mislead auditors, all with the intent to frame George Clooney. Her testimony corroborated much of what Tom had observed and had shared with the defense. The courtroom listened attentively as she explained the manipulations, emphasizing that George had never authorized any of these actions. The jury shifted in their seats, clearly absorbing the implications. The conspirators, previously confident, now appeared nervous, whispering to each other with worried expressions. After her testimony, Michael Douglas called Tom to the stand for the final time. The gallery went quiet, whispers trailing off as everyone realized the janitor was about to speak again. Tom took a deep breath and stepped forward, exuding quiet confidence. "Your Honor, members of the jury," Tom began, "I have worked at Langston Industries for over 10 years. During that time, I have observed the way documents are handled, how employees behave, and how information moves through the company. I can testify that certain documents presented as evidence against Mr. Clooney were altered to create a false impression of wrongdoing." The prosecution objected, but the judge allowed Tom to continue. His testimony was calm, precise, and detailed. He walked the jury through specific patterns of document manipulation, timelines of suspicious meetings, and the unusual behavior of certain employees involved in the scheme. He explained that dates on key financial records had been changed to suggest that George had approved questionable transactions, that signatures had been subtly forged, and that files had been intentionally misplaced to create the appearance of mismanagement. He also highlighted inconsistencies in the testimony of the managers who had orchestrated the conspiracy. The jury listened intently, clearly impressed by the clarity and logic of his testimony. Tom's calm demeanor and meticulous attention to detail left little room for doubt. Even the prosecution struggled to find gaps or contradictions in his account. After Tom's testimony, Michael Douglas presented the jury with visual aids, side-by-side comparisons of authentic and manipulated documents, timelines of employee activity, and charts showing the chain of actions taken to create false evidence. The jury could now see the conspiracy clearly, step by step, and the evidence aligned perfectly with Tom's observations. As the day progressed, the prosecution attempted to reinforce their case, calling additional witnesses and presenting supplementary documents. But each attempt was met with methodical counterarguments from the defense, often guided by the subtle notes Tom had provided. Every piece of evidence they presented could now be clearly explained as part of the manipulation, leaving the jury increasingly convinced of George's innocence. One particularly tense moment occurred when a senior manager, previously smug and confident, was called to testify. The defense carefully questioned him about document access, unusual behavior, and discrepancies in the reports. Tom's prior observations had prepared Michael Douglas to ask precise questions that exposed the manager's inconsistencies and revealed the deliberate actions taken to frame George. The manager fumbled, his confident exterior crumbling under the weight of the evidence. The jury leaned forward, absorbing the truth of the situation. The conspiracy was unraveling, and George's innocence was becoming undeniable. During a brief recess, George approached Tom quietly. "I don't know what to say," he whispered. "You've done more than anyone else could have imagined. You've saved my career, my reputation, and even this company." Tom smiled faintly. "I just noticed what others didn't, sir. The truth needed someone to speak for it. That's all." The afternoon session focused on closing arguments. The prosecution, realizing that their case had weakened dramatically, attempted a final appeal, but their words lacked conviction. They had presented evidence that had been discredited, witnesses who had been exposed, and documents that had been proven fraudulent. Their argument seemed hollow, and the jury's expressions reflected their skepticism. Michael Douglas, guided by the observations and evidence Tom had provided, presented the defense's closing argument. He emphasized George's integrity, the manipulations carried out by the conspirators, and the clear patterns of evidence tampering. He referenced Tom's testimony repeatedly, showing the jury how an overlooked employee had provided critical insight into the conspiracy. The courtroom was silent as Michael concluded. "The evidence clearly shows that George Clooney is innocent. The documents were altered, witnesses were coerced, and a plot was orchestrated to frame him. We ask you, members of the jury, to see the truth, to recognize the integrity of the man before you, and to deliver justice." The jury filed out to deliberate, leaving the courtroom in a tense silence. George remained at the defense table, composed yet clearly anxious. Tom quietly returned to the gallery, observing the proceedings with a sense of calm confidence. He knew the evidence was clear, and he knew the jury had seen it. Hours later, the jury returned. The foreperson stood, clearing their throat. "We, the jury, find the defendant, George Clooney, not guilty of all charges." A wave of relief and joy swept through the courtroom. George's eyes glistened with tears as he stood, shaking hands with his lawyers and colleagues. The conspirators sat in stunned silence, unable to hide their shock and embarrassment. The plan to frame George had completely failed, exposed by someone they had dismissed as invisible. George approached Tom, who had remained in the gallery throughout the announcement. "I can't thank you enough," George said sincerely. "You saw what others didn't, spoke when it mattered, and helped save me. You've done more than anyone else in this room." Tom shook his head humbly. "I'm just someone who noticed what was happening, sir. I didn't do it for recognition. I did it because it was right," George smiled. "Well, right or not, you've earned every bit of respect in the world. Today, the janitor has become a hero. In the days following the trial, the story of the invisible janitor who saved the CEO spread across the city. Employees, journalists, and even board members celebrated Tom's courage and intelligence. People who had once dismissed him as just the janitor now saw him in a completely new light. His quiet observation, patience, and unwavering integrity had changed the course of a major trial and saved an innocent man from ruin. Tom returned to his routine at Langston Industries, but nothing felt the same. Where once he had been invisible, unnoticed, and underestimated, he now carried a quiet confidence. Employees greeted him with respect, managers consulted him for insight, and George Clooney personally acknowledged his contributions. Yet Tom remained humble. He continued to clean the offices, polish floors, and tidy chairs, but now he did so with the knowledge that his actions, though quiet and unassuming, had made a monumental difference. He understood that courage and intelligence were not always about titles, recognition, or authority. Sometimes they came from those who observed, waited, and acted at the right moment. George Clooney ensured that the conspirators faced consequences for their actions. They were removed from the company, investigated for misconduct, and held accountable for their attempt to frame the CEO. The company's reputation was restored, and employees regained faith in the integrity of their leadership. In a quiet moment one evening, George invited Tom into his office. "I want to give you this," George said, handing him a small plaque engraved with the words, "For extraordinary courage, insight, and dedication, the one who saw what others did not." Tom smiled faintly, placing the plaque carefully on a shelf. "Thank you, sir. I don't need recognition. I just wanted the truth to come out." George shook his hand firmly. "You've done more than that. You've reminded everyone here that even the quietest person can make the greatest difference. We won't forget it." From that day forward, Tom Hanks was no longer just a janitor. He was respected, valued, and remembered as the person who had seen the truth, acted with courage, and turned the tide in a high-stakes trial. His story became a lesson in integrity, observation, and the quiet power of those who pay attention when others look away. And though he continued his daily tasks, sweeping floors, polishing desks, and tidying offices, he did so with a sense of fulfillment and quiet pride. For Tom, the world had finally seen him not just as a janitor, but as someone who could change the course of events, protect the innocent, and reveal the truth. In the end, justice had been served, the conspiracy had been exposed, and an invisible hero had finally received the recognition he deserved. And as he walked through the polished hallways of Langston Industries, Tom whispered to himself, "I may have been invisible, but the truth is never invisible. It always finds its way, and so did I."